So let's start by talking about the science of reading. What is, we hear that term, that is all of a sudden, so popular. The science of reading Facebook pages, thousands of followers. Everyone seems to be talking about the science of reading. What is it? Well, according to the International Literacy Association, which is, I like this definition the best, a corpus of objective investigation and accumulation of reliable evidence about how humans learn to read and how reading should be taught. I'm going to focus on two words there, really primarily, objective investigation and accumulation. I think those are the two criteria that we have to meet, objective investigation and accumulation. But the science of literature has shown effective reading instruction is complex and individualized. Complex and individualized. It's more than phonics. Many people now are saying, I've heard people say, as long as you're teaching explicitly, systematically teaching phonics, you're engaged in science of reading. Well, I will accept that you can't be engaged in science of reading if you're not teaching phonics, but just teaching phonics is not by itself representative of the science of reading. So remember the national reading panel's big five. Let's keep those in mind. Got to make sure to hit all five of the areas in developmentally appropriate ways, in ways that address kids who are struggling with their individual needs. So I'm going to make that point this morning. All right, so it's going to focus on a couple of words: objective investigation and accumulation. So let's start with objective investigation. It's experimental research, not descriptions, not logical arguments, not blogs or books. Now, I was doing a school district hired me to come do a training for them. And, to be blunt, I'm not very cheap. And I was doing this training on how to implement math interventions. It's about math, that's okay. And I was showing them how the importance of math fact, fluency of math facts, and showing them some ways to build that. And the assistant superintendent, who hired me, by the way, and was paying me and know how much I got paid, during this presentation in front of a whole group of teachers, so Matt, how do you respond to this study? And he handed me a piece of paper. I said, oh, let's see, what is it? I picked it up, and it was a blog. It was not a study. It wasn't even an article. It was a blog. And so I said, well, I thought this in my head. You pose the question, I'm going to respond. You're paying me. It's your choice. And so I explained to her why this was wrong and how completely misunderstood human learning. And but that was accepted to this person as evidence. It's not evidence. Anecdotes, blogs, books, logical arguments are not evidence. Empirical research, or I should say experimental research is evidence. And accumulation, we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So what's objective experimental research? Random assignment, random assignment, random assignment. Now, I'll tell you in a minute, I don't think random assignment's the answer to everything. I'll talk more about that in a second, but I want to make this point first. A lot of people that I hope one thing that comes out of science of reading is people are interested in reading articles now. And that's great. You can get them. Google Scholar. Google Scholar has so many articles on it. You can search something in Google Scholar. You want to see teaching, reading, decoding? Go to Google Scholar. Just Google Google Scholar. It's actually scholar.google.com. And you can search it and it brings up a bunch of articles, and you can download most of them for free. If you see just the abstract and not the actual article, and you want the actual article, just simply email the author, they'll send it to you. Getting research is no longer an issue. And it's even easier at a point I'll talk about in just a minute. But oftentimes when they read it, they'll say, well, significant results, and they say, oh, great, this is a good thing to use. I can point out dozens of studies that have significant results that still don't, I would argue, support use of the intervention. Don't get impressed by the almighty alpha. Don't say significant results, well, it must be good. I focus on the effect size. Now, this is, you don't need to know this, and I hope this doesn't freak people out when I put this up, but basically all this saying is you take the difference in the results of the two groups and divide by the standard deviations to put it on a common metric, common standard deviation unit. The alpha, the significance, is just the interaction of the effect size and the size of the sample. Lots of medical research gets significant results with an effect size very, very small, 0.08, 0.1, because they have giant ends, giant sample sizes, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 people. A very ineffective intervention can be significant with a large enough sample. So instead, look to see if it reports Cohen's D, it's called, or G, kind of the same thing. Look for Cohen's D or G. I want you to really focus on that. But this is oversimplified, but for common understanding, this is okay. 0.8 means a large, good intervention, large effect. 0.5 is okay, it's medium. And around 0.2 or less is small. The larger the number, the better. If it's negative, the kids that didn't get the intervention did better. Okay, so, a positive effect means the kids who got the intervention did better, and 0.8, 0.7, 0.9, that's a good intervention. 0.5 is okay, and less than 0.2 is small and negligible. If they report these two things, R squared or eta squared, if you see that funny thing, then it's a different metric. So 0.26 says a large effect. It's a whole different thing, 0.26 and 0.13. But generally speaking, most of them report this Cohen's D or G, and if not, it's simple to compute if you wanted to. But D or G, oh, by the way, this is not the actual formula for Cohen's D. This is the simplified version of it. I don't put the actual formula up there. This is the simplified version, just the average standard deviation and the difference in the outcomes. So how much better do the treatment kids do than the control kids divided by the average standard deviation of the two. That's not the actual formula, that's the simplified version of it. All right, so but anyway, look for that, 0.8, 0.5. And also, I don't have time to talk about this, I wish I did, but single case design research is a wonderful way to show experimentation, to show causality. It doesn't have good generalizability, but it has a wonderful way to show causality. So look at articles, they're easy to get now. I'll show you some syntheses in just a minute, but start looking at articles and look at the results and look at the research and see large effects, etc. But then keep in mind what Richard Feynman said. If you don't know who Richard Feynman is, you should Google him. His books are some of my favorites. He wrote On the Pleasure of Finding Things Out, which is a book I give all my first year doc students. He wrote several books. He was part of the Manhattan Project. He was a doc student in physics, and his advisor was chair of the Manhattan Project, the group that developed the atomic bomb. And he brought this grad student on. Now, he graduated before it actually started, but he was this, 28-year-old kid among these giants in physics. And he was completely irreverent. You got to read his stuff. And he's so funny. But he said, and I love this quote, if it disagrees with the experiment, it's wrong, period. It's that simple. That's the key to science. It doesn't make any difference how, he says guess for hypothesis, doesn't make any difference how beautiful your guess is, doesn't make any difference how smart you are, who made the guess, doesn't matter what the name of the person is. If it disagrees with the experiment, it's wrong, period. So if someone says, I think this is the way to go, it's the way to go, and studies say it's not, then it's not. And if science of reading is going to have a chance, we have to accept that as a basic premise. You could argue things for which there aren't a good research base yet, that's a different conversation. But if there is research and it shows it's not effective, it's not the way to go, period. And we have to accept that in order for science of reading to really influence practice. So I'm talking about experimentation, not quasi-experimentation, right? Quasi-experimentation is something different. Richard Feynman talks about cargo cult science. He talks about in the, I guess after World War II, my only source of this is what he wrote. After World War II, when we were in the Pacific, we being the United States military, the Air Force and Navy, occupied some islands in the Pacific that were good, had good strategic value. And once we got there, we found out there were people living there. We didn't know that. And they built airstrips and built these little sort of cities almost, and they were giving food and things to the inhabitants, and they were helping them out and giving them food and water and stuff. And then once the war ended, we left, and supposedly, again, Richard Feynman's my only source of information on this, supposedly the inhabitants at these remote isolated islands wanted the people to come back because they gave them food. And so they built a runway out of wood to look just like the runway that the Americans had built, the military built. And they were hoping that would entice the planes to land there. It looked just like it, but it wasn't the same. That's what Richard Feynman says happens a lot in research, what he calls cargo cult science. It looks a lot like science, but it really isn't. And in educational research, really what we're talking about is experimentation. Action research is not experimental research. Now, I'm going to defend that I'm going to defend action research in just a second. But it's not random. There's no baseline equivalence. So if we have two groups of classrooms and we do an intervention for this one, not for this one, and see the results, we have no assurance that these two groups are the same before we did anything. And we also have, I'm sure Lisa Sinetti talked about this, we also have to have implementation integrity. You have to have some evidence that the intervention was done as we said it would do, as we would do it. Now, again, there's a place for this type of research. You mentioned brain research. My favorite study in the entire world of brain research is the one by, well, Sally Shaywitz has done a couple of them, but Simos, S-I-M-O-S et al., 2001. There were several like this that showed that, yes, kids with reading problems didn't use the left hemisphere of their brain as often as kids who were normal readers. But once they did a good, solid intervention and redid the brain scan, the kids then who were struggling readers did start using the left hemisphere of the brain. So good reading instruction and good intervention actually changed how they used their brain. It's my favorite study of that. But think about it. Most brain research is not experimental. You can't randomly assign kids to reading problems or not. And they usually have very small N. There's usually, most brain research is like 15, 20 kids. These kids have reading problems. These kids don't. And wonderful books, a couple really great books by Gerald Coles, C-O-L-E-S, has looked at brain research and shown that among kids with reading problems, that type of research, every single time there's been some confounding variable because the sample size is only like 10 kids. But again, it has a place. Once we do good research that says there's a reason to suspect this is an effective intervention, now let's take it out into the schools and see does it work in that setting. That's wonderful. Action research is great to see what your particular school needs and what works for your particular school. Action research is part of that process. I would suggest getting good research that suggests it works, research that says it works in general in schools, and then research that says it works in your school. Fabulous, wonderful, that's great. But you got to start with good experimental research. So that's objective evidence. Now let's talk about corpus of objective investigation and accumulation. We're going to talk about objective, not descriptions, not logical arguments, not books. Now let's talk about accumulations. There's wonderful sources that now look at research and summarize it for practitioners. I do a lot of meta-analytic research. What that means is looking at, say, 20, 30, 40 studies or something, and looking at the average size of the effect. And that's done quite a bit now. Remember that 0.6, 0.8 sort of thing? I talked about a second ago, 0.8 large effect, 0.5 medium effect. So let's look at accumulation now. And this is basically, if you can see me, these are from John Hattie's book called Visible Learning, which I think is a wonderful tool. If you're not familiar with it, I highly recommend it. In it is basically, it's a summary of over 8,000 meta-analysis. And he takes every single thing you can think of and breaks it down to an effect size and puts it on a little chart like this. So let's start with whole language. Whole language programs, he found 64 studies, 197 effects, 630 people, and an average effect size of 0.06. Negligible. Remember, 0.5 is moderate, 0.2 is small. Negligible, almost no effect. Not a good intervention, not a good instructional approach. Compare that to phonics instruction, 114 meta-analyses, 425 studies, 6,000 effects, 12,000 people, average effect size of 0.6. Really good intervention, really good instructional approach. Looking at repeated reading, I'll talk about that later. Repeated reading, if you're not familiar with that. 54 studies, 156 effects. I don't know why it doesn't list the number of people, but an average effect size of 0.67. Really, good way to go. Comprehension programs, teaching main idea, teaching, inferencing, scaffolding, etc. 400 studies, 0.58. Good effect. He then did in that book I just showed you, did a really cool approach where he said, let's look at two ways to teach. Activator, drill and practice. There's a lot of criticism of people saying that drill and practice is not a good instructional approach, lots of practice. Its average effect size is 0.99. Like it works. One of the most powerful tools you can do is give good feedback, good immediate feedback. You got it wrong, you got it right, here's why you got it wrong, here's how to fix it, etc. Teaching metacognition, direct instruction, explicit instruction in sounds, etc. Mastery learning, formative assessment. overall effect size for all of these of 0.60. Now, let's compare that to what he called facilitator, simulation games, inquiry-based instruction, class size, problem-based learning, inductive teaching, average effect size of 0.17. So clearly, this research shows for hundreds and hundreds of studies that you're much better off drill and practice feedback, explicit instruction, mastery learning, formative, et cetera, than you are these more facilitative type instructional approaches. And that's, I mentioned from Hattie, the book I showed you a second. I'm going to show you two more websites right now. We do a new share. Hopefully find them quickly. I don't see them right there. Not sure why I don't. That's not the right one. I opened this window just to show this to you, and now I don't see it. All right, this will work. All right, are you seeing the website for the National Center on Intensive Intervention? Can you give me a thumbs up if you are? Good, thank you. So if you're not familiar with this, this is a wonderful resource for summaries of research. So I'm going to look, they look at assessment and intervention, academic and behavior. So today I'm talking about academic interventions. So I'm going to go to the academic intervention chart, click on that.
Sorry, we're not seeing that window. We can see a Zoom window.
Okay, thanks for telling me. Let me see. I don't know why it's not coming up. We definitely should now. Here it is. Okay, do you see it now?
Yes, thank you.
Good, thank you. All right, so go to tools chart, academic screening, behavior screening, academic intervention, behavior intervention. Click on that, academic intervention. And we're talking about reading today, but you can sort this by reading, math, grade level. Let's just look at reading interventions. Do apply filter. All right, so it rates studies. And you want to look for ones that have multiple studies, preferably, not just one, but it rates it. So if it gives it a full circle, that means it's rated well, and it lists the effect size. So, burst reading, not rated well, small effects. Failure-free reading, not rated okay, but small effects. Fast forward has one that has large effect with good study, a couple that have smaller effects with questionable approaches. We jump down a couple. Incremental rehearsal, which is one I do research in. Generally speaking, rated well, large effects, or good visual analysis with single case design. Let's see, there's a couple more interesting here. But you can go here and look and see there's lots of them to look at. Read 180, one of my favorite things to talk about because it's a really expensive program. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. I don't think it's the right intervention for a lot of kids. Good studies, but look at these effects. 0.07, 0.03, negligible effects. 0.20 is the best you see. So there's like 5 studies on there. The largest effect you see is 0.20. The median effect is 0.07. That's not good. Read naturally, talk about that in a minute. It's rated okay with varying effect sizes. I'll tell you why I think that is in a few minutes. Reading recovery, huge effect here, but not a good study. Again, huge effect here, but not a good study. DC1 with a decent study and a good effect. Anyway, you can look through these. Sound partners, one of my favorites. Show you that in a minute. Good effects, good intervention, good studies. System 44, good studies or so, but not great effects. All right. So that's one. Another one is this, the practice guides. So are you seeing the practice guide website now? Good. So you click on, you pick a topic. These are a group of guides written by researchers, and they get together and they look at the research and say, okay, this is what the research says are effective ways to go, and then they write the implications for teachers. So again, we're talking about reading. So let's use foundational skills, support reading for understanding, kindergarten through 3rd grade. Let's see, effective writers. You can see there's lots of them there. I'm going to pick one in a second here. Assisting struggling readers with RTI approach. Adolescent literacy instruction. So let's click on this one. And it tells you there's moderate evidence for screening. You should be screening. There's minimal evidence for differentiated reading instruction. There's strong evidence for systematic instruction on foundational skills. Minimal evidence for monitoring progress. Minimal evidence for combining various components of reading proficiency. So, and if you click on one, I won't now for time's sake, it'll explain to you step by step what that means and how to do it. They're written for teachers. They're very easy to read. They're all free PDFs. So I encourage that. Let's go back to this. All right. As I said earlier, I have other things I'll show you on the web. But as I said earlier, there's really no research is now available. I put in the PowerPoint the printout of that page. So if you have that in writing if you want it. But basically, there's lots of research out there and we can access it. I want to quickly finish up here with a few things that kind of have questionable research and then talk about interventions, et cetera. Multiple intelligences. Multiple intelligences is such a buzzword for a while. A review of 75 studies. Wow, 75 studies. Average effect size 0.08 or 1.08. This sounds great, right? Well, all of those studies were conducted in Turkey. Literally, all 75 were conducted in Turkey. 64 of them were master's thesis. 11 were dissertations. None of them actually looked at reading. None of them studied reading. There's just not a research base to support multiple intelligences. Level literacy intervention, LLI, commonly used reading intervention, most common reading program according to EdWeek Research Center. 43% of the schools in the country use it. One study I found, Ransford and Keldon, it's at the University of Memphis. And they report average effect sizes of 0.09, 0.32, 0.16. Small effects. And for the cost, you better get better results than 0.09, 0.32, and 0.16. One study, just not a good intervention. In fact, I use LLI as a control condition because it's an active intervention, but it's not a very good one. And then lastly, I'll talk about Orton-Gillingham, which I know is a sensitive subject. Lots of states are pushing for that, lots of parents. I love the decoding dyslexia movement. I think they've helped kids in a lot of ways. But some of the things they argue and advocate for, I think, are not a good idea. And this is one of them. I'm sorry, but it just is. Orton-Gillingham. Ritchie and Goke in 2006 looked at 12 studies. Only 5 found that Orton-Gillingham was more effective. And of those 12, 11 were quasi-experimental. Only 1 was experimental, and that was with college students, not K-12. So literally no experimental kids in 2000 studies with kids in schools in 2006. And of those, only 5 found an effect. So most of them didn't. This meta-analysis just came out. I'll show you a reference to it on my YouTube page in a few minutes. But just came out, 24 studies, 16 had data, 8 did not. The effect size was 0.32, not terrible. 0.14 for comprehension and vocabulary, but 0.32, not bad. But 20 studies had rated as unacceptable rating for methods. Their conclusion was there's just not enough research to suggest this is something that should be considered in policy yet. It's not a bad thing per se. I'm not saying it's a bad intervention. I'm simply saying the research is not there yet to suggest states should be requiring this for every kid. What does have good agreement? Systematic phonics instruction. Got to have it. Talked about that earlier. Cooperative learning. Dozens and dozens of experimental studies have shown a large effect for cooperative learning. It's probably the most researched instructional approach there is. Writing and reading should be integrated. Spelling equals decoding. Several studies have shown that spelling is a good indication of decoding. And if you're teaching kids how to spell and teaching them how to decode, these two things generalize to each other. And that it's important to teach the mechanics of writing. Teaching kids transcription, spelling, etc., really matters. All right, so that's an overview of the science of reading.